you mentioned before that you would like to talk about photoimmunology, and the immune system is very complex, and so lots of things. I guess we talked about these topics last time in our first meeting, that sunlight, in the view from the view of a dermatologist, normal dermatologist, and probably also internal medicine physician, they would claim that sunlight is an immune suppressant. And others would claim that, so sun worshippers would probably claim that it's an immune stimulant. And as always, I would like to refer to my favorite idea that the sunlight logic is neither black nor white. And if we say it's black and white, then it's the oscillation between day and night. And here the first photoimmunologic function comes into play. During daytime, there is an emphasis on locomotion, there is an emphasis on activity, and this is exactly not the comfort zone for the immune system at all. So if someone gets ill, let's say an inflammation caused by an infection, in this case, staying in bed and not moving and giving the immune system enough power to act completely and thoroughly, the immune system function is normally located in night times. So when you are not active, when your metabolism slows down, and when your system steps back from the sympathetic activities, when parasympathetic or vagus nerve activity prevails or comes into action, then the immune system will become active. And I probably also have mentioned before that we have humoral immune functions and we have cellular-based immune functions. And for example, during wintertime, the immune system has to fight bugs. During summertime, under sun exposure, the immune system has to take care of the cellular damage, which is part of the UV reaction and compensation pathway. So, for example, the so-called sunburn cells, which build up under solar radiation under the influence of UVB. You have heard of sunburn cells before, I guess? So they are, they can be understood as a primary damage from UV radiation, but you also can think about these swollen cells, which finally disintegrate, as sentinel zones where the UV radiation is transformed into a humoral radiation or into a molecular-based reaction pathway. So when these sunburn cells disrupt, they transfer their inflammation information to the other cells in the vicinity, in the close vicinity. And so the protection reaction patterns are triggered not only on a physical, but also on a biochemical pathway. And so this is part of the natural response. Maybe there also can be different views. classical dermatology probably would say this is the sign for destruction. I would probably say this is a sign for a cellular first-line reaction to ultraviolet radiation. But however you would look at this, it makes cellular immune system activity necessary. So during summertime, the immune system shifts into the cellular-based responses, and during wintertime, probably more into the humoral responses. So there are chronobiologically opposite phases and action patterns required by the immune system. So I would say sunlight exposure acts as an immune modulator. And this is, again, somewhere in between. It's not, it is damage, sign for damage, let's say immune suppressant, which would be the standard thesis. The antithesis would be sunlight is an immune stimulant, which is only partially true. And the truth is right in between the synthesis. It's that sunlight is an immune modulator. And as soon as you see something as a modulator, the individual reaction massively depends on the status quo before the exposure or the reaction patterns start. So there is no general answer. And this is the reason why I would like to not step much, much deeper into this photoimmunology discussion. Because, and everything I say doesn't take into account the individual status of the person who receives this message.
In the history of light as medicine, there was a very interesting gentleman by the name of Auguste Rollier, MD, who was a Swiss physician who became renowned for addressing a very difficult to treat at the time condition, lupus vulgaris, which was cutaneous tuberculosis. And there have been some amazing photos taken of his high altitude open air hospitals with images of young boys and young men and girls essentially dressed in white underwear, white hats, with quite a impressive tans, and some very interesting before and after pictures of debilitated, hectic, emaciated patients with quite severe tuberculous lesions, and then thriving and happy. And Rollier made his own comments about this process and the role of heliotherapy in that process. What is your analysis or your thought about what Rollier was doing?
What Rollier was doing, in my understanding, was what just described on the left side of this slide. He was performing heliotherapy. And when we today look about the ideal use of sunlight, then we, in many cases, probably in most cases, we talk about helioprevention. And yes, what Rollier did, I think I have even a slide which should address this a bit more. No, this was not the right slide. Is it this? Yeah, this is a kind of collage information taken from Auguste Rollier's recommendations and also the findings of Michael Hollick. What Rollier did was to expose patients on a regular basis, on a daily basis, starting with 5 minutes zone of the feet, and then feet and ankles, and so on, by increment of 5 minutes each day. The situation for exposure was very special, so you cannot just take the Rollier information and put it into any location thinkable, because what Rollier was performing was heliotherapy in the Swiss mountains, so above 2,000 meter, which means throughout the year, the UV portion in sunlight was rather constant. And this is a precondition for proper accommodation and adaptation to sunlight. So if you want to use sunlight in a diligent, intelligent, and favorable way, then regularity, regular exposure is key, because in this case, skin is able to adapt in a natural way. So constant availability of sunlight and exposure to a maximum duration of 20 minutes per side. Once you have reached the top of this incremental exposure pattern, or the bottom in this case, because it starts with the feet and then goes segmentally upwards until you reach the whole body. And what's interesting here as well in this infographics is that the head is not part of the exposure. The head should always, and has been, protected by a hat, by other measures, to prevent the head from being exposed. In the center picture, you also can see the guy here is wearing a hat and even uses an umbrella, because the central director, our brain, has to be protected from overheating, which is one side effect of sunlight exposure, heating of the tissue, which can be also subject to, and will be also subject to, individual interpretation. So if you like heat, and if you have the tendency to go to the extreme or to the limits, then you should prefer a sauna and not getting heat from sunlight, because this will probably mislead you. Others get the protective impulse from the heat felt in the skin, and others, depending on their preference, will react exactly in the opposite way, seeking for more heat, and this will most probably lead to an overdosage, this kind of regime. So individual preferences of sensitivity and how you would like to stimulate yourself by physical measures. This is not a good consultant, so to say, to make a proper solar sunlight dosing.
The other
And
key,
this was for Rollier, he had a strict regime. Yeah.
and to the point of the specific environmental conditions that Rollier developed his protocol and treated his patients, the high altitude, one aspect of that was it was the constant and potentially higher UV light compared to sea level. But the other aspect of altitude was the temperature. So what role did the cooler temperature at altitude play potentially in this process, particularly maybe with respect to light penetration?
Um, the role of temperature if you think about being in the mountains, skiing, for example, if the sun is up, the temperature, even in a snowy environment, is not really the issue. So I think it's guesswork, but I wouldn't see that temperature plays such a big role in this regard. But when you accept that heat is a signal in the skin, coming from the skin, that you probably should seek shade, then cold temperature or windy situation, which cools you off just by ventilation, increases the risk of ignoring the first signs of heat, leading to an avoidance reaction.
Mm.
And again, if you train yourself to, for example, by regular sunbathing, to indulge in the heat, then it's not a reliable consultant for your exposure anymore, because there has been a training or a kind of probably also driven by thought processes. Someone told you that it's good to be there in the sun, then you go out in the sun, you experience the heat. And the more you experience the heat, the more this will be entrained and linked to a specific pattern. For example, your body will learn that when you stand the heat for longer, the melanocortin related endocrine reactions will occur a few hours later. And this will lead to a different behavioral pattern. And here we are right in the middle of a very individual thing. And so this is something which is difficult to discuss for each and every one, because we are all different in this regard.
Absolutely. I guess that the thrust of my question was related to the observation that the photobiomodulation literature seems to have found that the most effective delivery of light is skin contact, and potential tissue heating can confound the penetration of light based on cutaneous vasodilatation and potential greater absorption. You don't subscribe to that?
I don't sub subscribe to that, because the removal of the heating aspect in photobiomodulation had the reason that you cannot stand the full spectrum of near infrared if you want to reach a certain dose level in deeper tissue. So the water filtering of luminous heat rays was the first idea to compensate for this heating process in order to come deeper and longer times, have this higher levels. But this is already a measure or a mechanistic strategy to exceed the natural dose levels. And photobiomodulation is prone to ignore these natural pathways, because in nature, when you look, for example, at sunlight, just let me see, because I have a slide here which is probably of interest in this context. When we look at the composition of the solar spectrum, then we find that in the infrared A we have 42%, in the visible we have 43%, and these are the predominant ranges in sunlight. And interestingly, infrared B, which is felt as heat, makes up to between 5 to 6%, and less than 0.5% is in the infrared C region. So if you feel heat under the influence of incident sunlight, it does not come from infrared, it does not come from infrared B, and even less from infrared C. It comes from the absorption in the visible part and in the UVA, UVA1, UVA2, and UVB. By the way, the UVB does not really contribute to the total energy, with less than 0.13%. So UVA2 and UVA1 plus the HEVL part of the spectrum, they contribute most to the appearance of heat by absorption. So it's a transformation of the radiation will be absorbed and transformed into molecular movement. Brown's molecular movement as one example. Molecular movement as a thermal reaction. And this is, I think I should point this out once more, that the heat we feel in sunlight is not coming from the classical thermal heat rays. It comes from transformation of potentially aggressive parts of the spectrum into molecular motion.
Yeah,
And photobiomodulation, if we are not using for thermotherapy, which was the precursor or predecessor of photobiomodulation, did show a completely different spectrum. It showed a thermal spectrum where you have increasing energy in the infrared B and in the infrared C part. And this is the part which directly produces thermal processes and thermal reactions. And here you could increase the treatment time by removing the part of the radiation which is responsible for tissue heating. And so the dose could be elevated. But the question of dose in this regard is also kind of interesting when we take the solar constant of about 1,300 whatever watt per square meter above the atmosphere. Then we have about 1,000 watts. For this, what we see here in this spectrum on ground level, meaning that we have about 400 watt per meter, which is 40 milliwatts per square centimeter of power in this range we are using for the photobiomodulation. And when you exceed the solar levels of spectral irradiance by a factor of 3, then you are already in the danger zone. And this is the risk of removing these coupled areas in the spectrum which directly can stimulate sensors. Because in this case, you are kind of tampering with the signaling, the hazard signaling pathways.
Is that to be taken as a, I guess, a warning about the use or the implementation of photobiomodulation at the moment, or as you see it currently?
So photobiomodulation is a pretty common thing, seemingly at the moment or in the meantime. But I was visiting the photobiomodulation Congress in 2024 in London. I think it was the 20th conference of the World Association for Laser Therapy. And there is still no consensus regarding the irradiances, regarding the dosage, regarding the wavelengths, because out of these tens of thousands of publications on low-level laser therapy, photobiomodulation, however you name it, they are inconsistent in metrology, in stratifying or not, cellular, animal, rodents, turtles, so or birds or earthworms. So there is no real consensus. For example, when you look at the intensity, when a lot of studies on photobiomodulation, they worked with punctiform light sources with lasers on reflex zones or acupuncture points, treating joint pain. So many of these studies did use a light source with a very, very high spectral irradiance, which exceeds what you would ever find in sunlight. When you shine a 1 milliwatt laser onto a white surface, which is illuminated by sunlight, you still see this red dot, which means that the spectral irradiance of this laser point is higher than in sunlight. Otherwise, it would be masked for vision. So, and this is just a 1 milliwatt laser. So if you take now the parameters from a laser treatment, which had a duration of probably less than 1 minute per point treated, then you might become misled if you extrapolate these parameters to a full body treatment or upper body treatment, large area panels. And if people are not aware of the context, they hear that photobiomodulation is positive and they Google or wherever do their search, and then they find expensive devices, they find cheaper devices, and even cheaper devices. And so they have to make a decision. So how would you decide if there is for example, there is a number of 20 milliwatt per square centimeter irradiance versus 120 milliwatt per square centimeter? Many of them, and if this even is cheaper, this device with the higher irradiance, why not take this? People are unaware of, for example, of the fact that all these devices are based on LEDs. So if you produce a batch of LEDs, red LEDs, let's say 660 nanometers, none of these LEDs are fully identical. So you have to do binning, which means you have different bins for the different properties of these LEDs. And now you measure the emission. And if the emission is exactly 660 nanometers, you put these LEDs in the same bin. Then you take this bin and check for onset voltage. Again, some switch on at 2 volts, others at 2.4 volts. So you have to bin for voltage, for onset of proper emission. But then you find that probably the bandwidth is also worthwhile being binned. So you get another batch of bins. And in the end, you have many, many different bins, which in the end, one single bin fulfills the requirement. And the other bins, what do you do with these LEDs, which are incoherent in terms of identical operation parameters? So you could probably develop the idea to take these bins the customer doesn't need because they don't match the requirements and put them into a device to not dispose them off in a trash bin, but disseminate them on the market. Yeah, and I'm sure that many of those who think that they are aware of what's going on in photobiomodulation have no clue about these stories. But then, for example, the next story is that the power emission and the driving power for an LED are two completely different things for an engineer who is trained. But some are assembling panels and confuse these two completely different parameters, the electrical operation parameter and the optical emission parameter. And if it would really happen that you finally have purchased a cheap 250 milliwatts per square centimeter powerful device, then you exceed the 250 milliwatts per square centimeter equals 2,500 watts per meter squared, which means this is compared to the 400 watt we find here in this graphic, much more than you ever would find in nature. And then there is no heat warning mechanism active. And so you are really prone to be at risk for an overdose. And the thing is that since in sunlight and fire, all spectral components are coupled under a natural biological relationship, that the deeper tissues are not prepared for such an overdose in terms of power per wavelength in the part where the radiation under normal circumstances is allowed to penetrate deepest.
Yeah, I think what you describe has been part of my concern as well, but the proliferation of devices of all manner and provenance, and definitely a proliferation of marketing terms that exploit or capitalize on by ignorance. And so, yeah, absolutely, wise words and precautious words for the use of isolated light wavelengths. My thought is, before we, just to think about that, finalize that topic, is what you're going to get at the sunrise and sunset is a natural package of red and near infrared enriched light that necessarily is lacking in more shorter wavelength light. So that is probably the best time that people would want to expose themselves deeply because they're at less risk of the complications that you've raised so far in this discussion.
So when you look at this slide, you can see that if we accept that our body has developed protective measures, especially for UVB, UVA, and HEVL, then the least critical situation is around sunrise and around sunset, because here we have visible plus near infrared, but no low levels of HEVL and no UVA nor UVB. Yes.
And incidentally, that's also a fantastic time to be in terms of the circadian day, especially the morning, for anchoring your circadian rhythm, for stimulating the circadian system. So starting with the sunrise, I think is a great place for people if they've launched into this discussion and already feel maybe a bit overwhelmed with the technicalities. But you can very safely start with sunlight. I think we can say that much.
Yeah, for sure. And what we see here on this slide is the amplitude behavior of the pendulum of night and day. And when you start out during in dark night and the Nordic rise of intensity starting at less than 1 lux is in the dark blue, then if you come from darkness, or saying it a bit easier, if you come from darkness and your environment turns red suddenly, then your body expects that the next phase will be day. And if it's bright and gets darker and red, it's clear to your autonomous system that the next phase will be nighttime. So the zero crossing of this of the sky colors, the zero crossing is also always linked to the red as a visible signal that it now will change either from day or from night into the opposite. So again, stratification, it depends on what has actually been, and then red signals the change is coming now, and how it will change depends on how it is, in a way.
And maybe framing this concept for people who may have heard of in briefly, circadian function and the idea of a light dependent orchestration of body function. When this order is disrupted, and perhaps people see some evening, late afternoon red light, and then they go home to their indoor lit LED environment. I mean, how do you think about this effect in terms of health impacts? Because uh, again, I feel like with people aware of junk food and these other detrimental health inputs, but I think what you and I are both trying to educate on is the significant role that disruption of this light dependent system has to human health.
Again, a slide which demonstrates that let me see if I can put in the pointer, additional settings pointer here. Here the light comes in and it's evaluated via a visual pathway. and it's evaluated via a non-visual pathway. And in the midbrain, there is the connection with the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland, in opposite to the pineal gland, is responsible for sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system signaling, but also hormonal signaling on the vegetative system, on the mineral system, the acidity of the tissue and of the blood, the activity of the immune system, the body heat, the amount of energy which is produced, and the blood sugar level. So this is what light signals will do to the highest regulation area in our brains. And if you are out of sync, then your body in the first step will probably just need more energy for compensating this out of syncness. Here we are in the region of functional disorders, which can be corrected via light as the most important and predominant stimulus for the body clock, and also for the correction of the or disturbance of the body clock. But then thermal stimuli, the regularity of food intake also contribute to that. And ideally, you should live a coherent life, which is not just looking at the predominant regulator, but also at the subset of other regulation parameters or influences, so that all are aligned in a proper way. And for example, if you have no light to synchronize yourself, then still the regularity of getting up at the same time, going to bed at the same time, even if you would live in an unlit cave, the regular behavior of your biological functions, water intake, whatever you do on a regular basis contributes to the resynchronization, or if you do it in a random way, desynchronization of your inner clock.
It's a good segue, I think, to the effect of light on metabolism. And you mentioned in that slide just past how glycemia, blood glucose level, is potentially affected by this non-visual light pathway. In clinical medicine today, my interest in my specialty of practice, family medicine, we see metabolic dysfunction all day, every day, and people sit on a scale of disease severity from your small amount of ectopic fat deposited, in around the viscera in the abdomen, and all the way to full blown, insulin dependent type 2 diabetes. So for me, this is a big problem that needs addressing, and I would really like your opinion about how the light and the circadian system feeds into the physiology of this system.
May I show another
Please.
slide? Okay, so when I think most of these problems can be referred to an overstimulation of this area here, because the non-visual pathway, which is mediated by the melanopsin, carrying intrinsic photoreactive retinal ganglion cells. Here you can see there is a separation of the radiation which is incident to the eye. So for the visual pathway, we have these contributors. They end up finally somewhere here in the visual cortex. And the non-visual pathway goes directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And here in the midbrain, there is a direct connection to the pineal gland and the pituitary gland. And not a direct connection to the pineal gland, because this indirect connection, it's a longer pathway to the pineal gland, which is the epiphysis, and the hypophysis. This is the more direct pathway, the shorter pathway. Here we have the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is responsible for adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, alpha MSH, beta endorphin, thyroid stimulating hormone, estrogen, prolactin. So the whole bunch of hormones which are controlled via the pituitary gland. And an overstimulation of this pathway is the culprit when we have high blood sugar levels. Cortisol, as a glucocorticoid, is mainly responsible for that. And if we don't work or act away the stress hormones, which are these representatives here, then we find elevated blood sugar levels. In the end, the outcome will be some metabolic disease like diabetes type 2. And the outcome of the influence of the thyroid, which regulates the metabolic activity level, the impact on hormones, overstimulation of the pituitary hormones is, in my understanding, the direct culprit for the civilization-associated diseases, cardiovascular disease, cancer, because cortisol is also an immune suppressant, and metabolic disturbances like diabetes and adipose body pattern. Yeah, it's in my understanding, a mismatch between the stimulation of pituitary gland activity and behavioral patterns and environmental properties.
And to spell it out even more clearly for the listener, the overstimulation of the pituitary is happening because an individual is going home and using artificial light at night that is rich in these melanopically stimulating wavelengths and in stimulatory position overhead and in bright lights, bright intensities, and as well as these self-luminous devices, iPads and iPhones. And that is where this pituitary stimulation is coming from. Whereas in an ancestral environment, they would have the pineal gland kicking in because the absence of that light would allow the melatonin to be secreted and sleep to be onset by that time.
Yeah, but I think you're talking about the overall situation between day and night. And I think in order to understand the physiological roots of this is to introduce not something between day and night. And normally when we think about day, we think about the situation to the left on this slide. We are talking about sunlight, and sunlight is there is a misunderstanding that many guys would think that sunlight is the ideal daylight illumination characteristics. But this is, in my understanding, it's not based on biology, because what's based on biology is when we look about when we talk about the vision pathway, the visual pathway, then we talk about the so-called V lambda curve, and the V lambda curve is the curve you can see here close to the central area of this slide. This is the V lambda curve, and this is the brightness sensitivity curve of the human eye. Okay, so all our vision is based on this V lambda function. And when we ask the question, why did our eye develop this specific sensitivity curve for visible photons, then we have a strong hint in this spectrum, because what you see here is what my spectrometer did when I put a plant leaf above the aperture. So what I measured here is the chlorophyll green from a green plant. So this little hump here in the green is the low level intensity under the canopy leaf in the rainforest. And you have 5 to 10 times more near infrared compared to what you see here in the green. So if you would pull this curve up to the top, you would end up with the V lambda curve. Can you follow?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but there is another curve here. It's the OPN4 curve, and this is the melanopsin absorption curve, more or less. And this curve is shifted into the region of 480 nanometer with the peak. And here I would like to come back to the previous slide. The longest time our ancestors did spend during daytime hours protected by the canopy. And this does not only apply to our primate relatives, it also in a way applies to us, because would you think that you could survive in this particular situation on the left for longer times?
And for those who can't see the slide, it's a desert environment.
It's a desert environment. Yeah, but in this case, I shouldn't probably show any more slides, because if they can't see that, it doesn't really make sense to talk about it on that base, right?
Well,
But
some listen and some so
anyhow, I'll just go on. So the non-visual pathway has been established to evaluate the desert situation. The visual pathway was developed to be visually oriented in the living area where you spend most of your time being awake. And then the nighttime for humans, probably up to 2 million years backwards into the past, was the either darkness, the total absence of sunlight, and darkness, or firelight. And the forest situation is the least is the situation which puts the least stress on our vegetative system, on our organism. This should be the standard situation for being inside. And this is exactly the opposite of what the lighting industry at the moment is trying to achieve. They are proud of being able to bring the sunlight, the solar spectrum inside our living spaces, inside built environment, and therefore constantly overstimulating this hormonal pathway I was showing here. So yes, it's a problem if you suppress the melatonin secretion during evening and nighttime, but it's at least as well as a problem if you overstimulate the activity pathway via the pituitary gland hormones during daytime. Because melatonin suppression during daytime is not it's not the problem. The problem is that melatonin is just a proxy for the absence of pituitary gland hormone levels. It's easy to measure from saliva, the melatonin, but the real effect of blue enriched light is stimulating the sympathogenic, the performance dominating stress hormone bunch. And this overstimulation without necessity in regards to our metabolism, when you are reclined on a branch of a tree, you're not metabolically overactive. You don't need blood sugar. It's a balanced state. It's a harmonious state. Somewhere it's an environment. So this forest spectrum is an environment where your body can relax because there is no threat from shortwave radiation. There is plenty of regenerative near infrared, and there's just enough light intensity for optimal vision. So we have this forest situation. We should go for in my understanding, we should try to replicate this particular spectral characteristics as our basis, as our ground state. And when we step down from the trees, when we leave our cave, then the environment will become will change its dignity in a way so that we need the stress hormones. But if we don't need them because we just sit all day in front of our computers, we don't need the stress hormones, or we shouldn't overdose them in this situation. But this is exactly what happens with a screen which is delivered with 5,700 Kelvin color temperature as a normal standard setting. And you actively have to reduce this when you find it in the menu, or you actively have to mitigate the radiation by wearing these glasses you are wearing and I'm wearing as well. So I think this has to become more clear how the things which are just shortened and inadequately simplified. And in the end, you get an easy recommendation, which probably does not address all the requirements of everyone.
I think it's so powerful to look at the actual spectral distribution of these different light sources, because it tells such an important and visual story, which is, if someone were to invent a indoor light environment that is the most opposite to this ancestral forest, rainforest, which is hugely enriched in near infrared and has a peak in around 555 nanometers in the deep in the green, and attenuated at short wavelength light. If they tried to create the opposite to that, then they couldn't have done a better job than what they have done, which is these LED fluorescent light bulbs, which have stripped out all long wavelength light, highly enriched in invisible and high energy visible, and simply blast us with them all day, every day, in an indoor environment. So thank you for explaining that, how that's potentially overstimulating us, and really putting it that way, because people 99% of people have no inclination about how abnormal this is compared to their ancestral photophysiology.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and by the way, I even have developed in my bedroom. I have a lamp which exactly produces this spectrum here.
Mm. On the right of your slide, you have firelight, and I'll describe it again for people. It's If you look at the spectrum, it has a gradually increasing slope, from short, very, very little, blue, but a little bit more green and yellow, and then deep into the orange and red, and then into the near, mid, and far infrared. That's what fire lamp looks like. And you don't have a image of an incandescent bulb, but
It's almost identical.
that was going to be my point. And so, if we're thinking about the most basic advice for people to create a more human friendly indoor lighting environment, then going back to the humble incandescent or halogen light bulb might be the simplest thing that they could do.
In fact, it's the simplest thing that they could do. Um, but there's something probably in many aspects improved thing which I have developed during the last 2 years. And this is what you can see here in the back. I'm just removing myself um, from the slide. I call them heliolumen LEDs. So it's 4 different types of LED light sources, which are enriched in near infrared. So they have broadband near infrared emission, which does not contribute directly to the vision process, but indirectly contributes to skin health and etc. So kind of photobiomodulatory part, which we also find in all these spectra we see here, the natural spectrum during daytime exposed to sunlight in the forest situation and in the nighttime situation. The common part, spectral part, is the near infrared. This is the only part of the spectrum which is present everywhere. So this is, for me, it was important to have LEDs, and the shortcomings of standard LEDs are that you don't have the near infrared available. And when I take one of these heliolumen LEDs, you can see they are deprived or reduced in the blue. The typical blue of an LED, this blue peak at 450 nanometer, is almost gone. We have kind of ripple in the spectrum in this range, but this is important for color rendering. But then we have massive amounts of near infrared. The peak in the red is shifted to the longer photobiomodulatory wavelengths. So this is for me a major step towards a natural spectrum. And the difference, for example, if we take this spectrum we see here, it is from the appearance, the color of the light and the color rendering, it's closest to the incandescent spectrum, but it does not contain the heat which is emitted by an incandescent lamp. And it does not, you can operate the LED with drivers which are flicker free. And this is, there is a myth going around that incandescence would not flicker. This is just not the case. If you measure the flicker of an incandescent lamp, which is operated on alternating current, the mains grid, then you find a 120 hertz temporal light modulation with the modulation depth up to 15%. Yes, it's for most of us, it's imperceivable if they don't know how to perceive it. But for example, who is familiar with the stroboscopic plate on a record player, this works with an incandescent lamp operated on mains, that you can regulate the speed of your record player with this stroboscopic disc, as an example. Many have this probably in mind who are familiar with record players, but with a meter, flicker meter, you definitely can show that standard incandescents transport the 120 hertz in the United States when there is the mains frequency of 60 and a mains frequency of 50 hertz in many other regions of the world. They would make an incandescent lamp flicker at 100 hertz. And this temporal modulation interferes with many frequencies and oscillations in our organism. And so it's always the best to fully eliminate all the flicker, all the temporal light modulation, which is present under the wrong operating conditions of a light source. So if you want to optimize the temporal light modulation of an incandescent lamp, you have to use low voltage halogen lamps operated on 12 volt and operate them on a grounded, earth-linked DC with very low ripple. Or even better, a battery. So you have a constant power supply and you have a thick filament of a low voltage 12 volt halogen lamp, then you have no ripple at all if you are operating it on a battery. So this is top one on the list. Halogen operated on DC, clean DC. And now, since these LEDs have been created, in my understanding, this is the level 2, and it's better than level 3, which is the standard incandescent lamp, because the standard incandescent lamp produces more heat than required and is prone to transport the mains frequency doubled.
It's a great, maybe a point to discuss quickly the biological effects of flicker, and you talked about the stroboscopic effect. I had a patient recently who had a concussion, quite severe, and he's having a post-concussive syndrome, and he is exquisitely sensitive to artificial light, and he's finding that environments with flickering artificial light, the gym, his workplace, is extremely provocative of a various number of his post-concussive symptoms, and simply wearing blue light blocking glasses, being out in natural light, is helping immensely. Can you speak to that the flicker effect biologically for a little bit of time?
Yeah. So with flicker, we could probably start with cinema technology, and with electrical lighting technology from scratch, more or less. We know that there was the electricity battle between Tesla and Edison. Edison was favoring the direct current idea, and Tesla was a fan of alternating current. The reason was that alternating current can be transported um, many kilometers, and direct current cannot. And so finally, um, Tesla won the battle, with the result that we have grids in our households or supplying our households which are based on alternating current. And since the flicker fusion rate of humans is between 20 and 30 hertz, you can show a film, or you can induce the impression that you are looking at something which is continuously moving with 24, 25 slides, pictures per second. Mm, the reason why we don't need higher temporal resolution is that we are not moving fast enough. For example, birds or insects. When a bee is sitting in the cinema, it looks like or appears like a slideshow to the bee. What's going on there? Single slides.
Mm.
Uh, and for us, it's a film, a vivid film. So 25 pictures or slides per second make up a film mm, environment or experience. So they thought, okay, then we are well set when we double this frequency to 50, 60 hertz respectively. This only worked because there were only incandescent lamps these days. The discharge lamps, which are much faster in response of the temporal changes of alternating currents, they were starting to pose a problem when the fluorescent lamps evolved and um, entered the stage. So for for a filament in a thermal emitter, mm, which is kind of buffering the grid frequency, it was okay with double the fusion flicker frequency, but for faster responses in light emission, like you would have it in a discharge emission, or even more so in an LED. If you switch on an LED, the LED doesn't have to heat up. So this is an instant pop up. And if you switch it off, it's instantly off and stops emission. So you can transfer very high frequencies with LEDs and also with other fluorescent lamps, but not in the same controllable way. But with the advent of swiftly responding emitters, it turned out that 60 hertz isn't enough. And even 120 hertz isn't enough, and even 250 hertz isn't enough. And if the objects are moving under flickering light, you get stroboscopic effects as phantom array effects up to 2000 hertz and even above that. So the temporal light modulation, this switching on and off of the light can be soft in a thermal emitter and can be harsh in a non-thermal solid state, for example, solid state emitter like an LED. So the LED follows everything what the transformer or the driver is telling the LED to do. So you can even hide music in the light modulation when you modulate the LED accordingly, but it also works with incandescent lamps. The quality of the music you can transfer or transmit by modulating the electrical stream which feeds the bulb, is a little bit less high quality for an incandescent lamp, and it's a higher quality, a clearer sound for an LED. So why should we avoid this additional information? The reason is it just doesn't appear in nature. This is, for me, the best reason to avoid it if we don't want to use it as a therapeutic means. So pulsating light can be used as a therapeutic and is even more effective compared to continuous light in many cases in phototherapy. But as a standard illumination property, temporal light modulations should be avoided as effectively as possible. Because it's information which can be, for example, when you hook on electrodes on the brain of a primate or also a brain of a human, and you shine 250 hertz pulsated light into the eye of the experimentation subject, you can measure in the EEG reading that the brain processes the 250 hertz. We don't know exactly how this comes. So the final pathway has not been fully identified yet, but we can tell from experiments that it comes through. And if we can even operate in under intense flicker as long as we are healthy. But exactly as you told before, the patient with concussion somehow lost the compensatory filters for eliminating flicker in terms of counteracting flicker in an active way. So it's a performance thing of our brain to keep the light steady and to keep vision steady. But this is not even true for our whole vision, because the peripheral vision is highly susceptible for temporal variations, and the central vision is less receptive for the flicker. So if you are exposed to a flickering light source, it could even happen that you directly look into the light source and the flicker disappears. And if the light source is just in the periphery and meets peripheral areas of the retina, it appears as flickering again. It's a little bit as you would find it in smartphone cameras. They have strategies, algorithms which actively remove the flicker or compensate for the flicker effect in the area you are pointing the camera at.
Yeah, thank you for that deep dive into this idea of flicker, and two key points that I'll highlight is as you mentioned, that the filament is a thermal light source. So when you have an incandescent bulb, the electricity is essentially heating up a piece of metal in the context of an inert gas, which allows it to emit heat and light without essentially burning out. That's why they're called halogen lamps, and that the fact that it's has, I guess, an inertia to some degree buffers it from the oscillations of the power grid. But a poorly engineered or primitively engineered LED has no such buffer and is therefore potentially responsible for a greater degree of flicker and effect on negative effect on the visual system through this stroboscopic effect and migraine. Or I mean, that's just the beginning. Fatigue, inattention are all the possible side effects and outcomes. And people potentially have cumulative fatigue and non-specific symptoms from working indoors or all their working life, and very few, I think, are attributing that to their light environment and their exposure to something like a flicker and the blue light hazard and the and blue light enriched light.
Yeah, but again, it's not the light source.
Mm,
It's the combination of light source and power supply.
mm,
And a well-made power supply leads to the full elimination of flicker in an LED. So
mm.
it's just a decision of the electronic engineer. If you tell him or her to remove flicker, it's possible. And if you don't specify this as a quality requirement for the light source to be built or designed, then the flicker might be there because it's not even cheaper in our times to make flicker-free drivers. It's just the lack of regulatory definition. If the definition would be you must not sell flickering light except for therapeutic purposes, um, then this is what happens actually on the market.
And I think the crux of that problem is that you have engineers and bureaucrats who aren't talking to or enlisting or consulting biologists, photobiologists. So
Mhm.
so you have people who are simply building technical specifications that disrespect the physiological needs of Homo sapiens, and it's ignorance, perhaps more than anything, rather than, I guess, malicious intent. It's just pure ignorance of what humans need from from a light source. That we're kind of partially in this situation. It seems to me.
I think one semester of biophysics would be a good idea for a physicist.
Absolutely, and maybe we'll. Can we talk a little bit more about this key role of near infrared? Because in those natural environments that you displayed on your slide previously, you made the point that that's the only commonality. Are you aware or have you followed the recent work by Professor Robert Fosbury, astronomer, and his
Glenn Jeffrey,
and Scott Zimmerman in their role of near infrared in mitochondrial metabolism?
yeah, they are uh, on the they are working on the basis which had been created by Tina Caro and Remester. It's a field which is under scrutiny since the 1960s and 1970s. Yeah, of course. The reason why I created these four LED types, um, producing high amounts of near infrared together with the visible light, is that that we are living in a near-infrared deprived environment since the incandescent lamps have been banned. Here I have taken a photo with a photo conversion filter in front of the aperture. And this looks bluish. This is a kitchen which is lit by fluorescent lamps and LEDs. And directly in the other room, I took a picture. This room is completely lit by incandescent lamps. And the filter I'm using here transforms near-infrared light into red light. So everything which is lit up or enlightened by in this appears in this red hue. This picture proves this is a room filled with near-infrared. And the other room is a room with total absence of near-infrared. And since we are unable to see it with the naked eye, we run into such a situation almost everywhere. And in addition to that, the problem is that the window glass in many cases reduces the incident near infrared even further. So even during daytime, you have decreased levels of near infrared in the rooms when the daylight shines through the windows. And during evening and nighttime, it's a complete lack of near infrared. And as always, we are more fascinated by the shorter wavelengths, so vitamin D deficiency when there is a lack in UVB, nitric oxide deficiency when there is a lack in UVA. The signaling via the OPN4, if there is an increase in 480 nanometers. But I think the next step, the next consequent step and logical step is to raise awareness to the fact that we are forced by administration to live in a near-infrared depleted, in my sense, biologically dead lighting environment created by energy-efficient light sources.
Yeah, it is a special type of starvation, and Fosbury has described it as he calls it 21st century scurvy, which is this parallel or analogy to the absence of vitamin C and in 18th and century and 19th century ship travel, and chronic deficiency leading to an outcome, in that case scurvy, and in this situation a chronic deficiency of near infrared light, and from their work and their emphasis on mitochondrial metabolism is that you are leading to mitochondrial inefficiency because you're depriving a key input into the mitochondrial electron transport chain. And that in addition to the overstimulation of the pituitary function, as you mentioned earlier, I personally think that it's also the complete deprivation of near infrared photons and their assistive role in mitochondrial metabolism that's underlying this metabolic disease that we're
But
also.
I would like to mention in this regard that, of course, we have an own near-infrared metabolism, which is already active in our cells. Otherwise, our cells wouldn't be able to survive or even came to birth anyhow. So it's not the case, in my understanding, that we depend on environmental near-infrared in order to survive. But in order to thrive, we for sure depend on it, and especially if we are in disorder. And this is the point I think it's important to distinguish. that photobiomodulation and near infrared is photobiomodulatory agent. Photobiomodulation stimulates when there is an hypoactivity, and deprives or dampens if there is an hyperactivity. Which means as long as we are fully intact, we have what we as long as we are fully intact, we are 2 hours or longer outside. We are not using too many modern high-tech windows. We are not using cold light sources, but thermal light sources or light sources with thermal characteristics. And then we don't develop a kind of near-infrared deficiency. But if we are challenged, for example, when we look again to this slide here, the forest lighting, then we have this low intensity in visual stimulation. And for example, with the same filter which I'm using here in this situation, when I'm when I step outside with the camera and the filter, every green plant appears red, because what we see is just a little green, and what is there is 20 times more in the red and near infrared. And when we turn this near infrared intensity into the visible part, we become aware of the fact that plants are near infrared emitters.
Mm.
And since we are not able to survive without water, we seek areas which provide a high probability of presenting or keeping water for us. So this is in a plant environment, because where you find water in nature, you find plants.
Mm.
Mm, and so the more synthetic our environment is, and the longer we stay indoors, the more important it becomes how the indoor situation is lighting wise structured and designed. This versus that. So I prefer definitely this before that, and we should go for this situation in a way to balance every time we have been exposed to this kind of situation.
It's fascinating to think about how the physiology of, or the how the biosphere has evolved, and this idea that plants are using relatively high energy photons in the visible range to perform photosynthesis, and then are essentially emitting or reflecting longer wavelength light, and we as humans are essentially making use of that so-called, I guess you could call it, unnecessary waste, almost energy, for our own metabolic means, and then perhaps re-emitting longer wavelength light, and it makes you think of this idea of life, take a step back, as this dissipative system where we are taking energy and using it to maintain our far from equilibrium state, and then emitting it again, which I think you described in one of your lectures as sunlight turning the wheel of life and emitting
Yeah,
into space the cold into the cold space the longer wavelength light.
it's around 10,000 nanometers what we are emitting on average from 8,000 to 12,000 roundabout. There is definitely a peak, an emission peak. And this is the thermal waste. And our body has to get rid of this. And every part of the spectrum with shorter wavelengths, and this is, for example, the near infrared, hits the largest volume radiation-wise. When you look at the solar spectrum again, then we can say in this short wavelength range, there is a penetration depth of less than 1/10 of a millimeter. And in this part between the orange-red and in this part here, orange-red to 1,400 nanometers or 600 to 1,200 nanometers, here we find the optical window of our body. And in the range, in the wavelength range between orange-red up to the near infrared around 1,000 nanometers, we have the highest penetration depth, meaning that the largest volume of body tissue comes in contact with these wavelengths. We have penetration depths in the range of up to 5 centimeters and even more within this optical window of our body. Yeah, so there is an, if we would have to heat up our body to 37 degrees Celsius, what is it in Fahrenheit, around 96, or what is the body temperature?
We deal with Celsius in this part.
Okay. Okay, this is practical for me. So 37 degrees of Celsius to bring the temperature to this level automatically means that the less absorption from around you have, the more effort you have to put into this heating requirement. And if you start at the 0 Kelvin point, minus 273 Celsius, if you have to heat the system up by 310 Kelvin, this is much more effort to take, and it's almost impossible. So if we wouldn't take about 60% or so of the radiation from our environment, even if it's by temperature 20 degrees of Celsius, so we have to heat it up only by 17 degrees Celsius. And the near infrared radiation for sure is participating in this thermal management system. So we are kind of greenhouses. In a greenhouse, the window lets the shorter wavelengths in and blocks the longer wavelengths. So the longer wavelengths are captured inside. And something similar happens in our body. We can take in the near infrared radiation, but then once it's transformed into longer and even infrared B, C, and so warmth, thermal energy, locomotional, elementary energy on atoms and elements and molecules, then it's kept inside in the thermal compartment. And with each interaction, the wavelengths become longer. And once we reach this range of 8,000 to 12,000 nanometer, there are tricks our body has developed to get rid of this thermal waste finally. And if we wouldn't be able to get rid of this thermal waste, we wouldn't be able to take up new shorter wavelengths, which are much more usable than these long wavelengths we want to bring out of the system.
All that to highlight the essential role that light and sunlight has played in the evolution of life. I think that's again another elegant way of presenting the same fact that when I speak to every expert and um in this topic, it just reminds me of the elegance of this whole system and how we wouldn't be as we are now without sunlight and solar light as an input. And I think we both agree that the depravity of this key, or 42% at least, of 50, more than 50 when you percent of natural solar light is being deprived from indoor environments. I mean, that is the problem that I think we're working to solve, and that everyone I think needs to be educated more about.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we can finish on a topic about nighttime, um, and beyond the basic circadian role of night. I don't want to say basic to belittle it or trying to minimize it. It's obviously one half of this key circadian function. But I want you, if you can, talk about what is the emission that you would measure during nighttime? Um, is what type of light is hitting us in the visible and the non-visible in a nighttime? Uh, to me, it seems like that's highly related about the moon phase and what's necessarily being reflected from the lunar surface. Is that correct?
Oh, it it depends on where you dwell. It's if you are living in a house, if you are living in a cave, if you are sleeping under the skies, um, without being protected by some protection layer, it's not really recommended to stay outside during nighttime without a carpet or a blanket or some protection. I think in former times it was even forbidden for sailors to sleep on deck unprotected. I have read this before. So yeah, if there is visual access to the night sky, then we are oscillatory wise exposed to more or less moonlight, depending on the cloudiness of the sky. And somehow the moon cycles are anchored in human physiology, especially in female physiology. It's even more prominent that there is a coincidence between the moon cycle from new moon to new moon and the menstrual cycle. If we would like to fully explore the chronobiology, then it could be a good idea to have visual access or visual pathways or windows or doors opened to this celestial theater. I think we should start and set kind of priorities to first bring our circadian rhythms in order, and the next step would then be to also synchronize to the lunar cycles. But the problem is that in our society, the light at night is such a severe issue that it's hard to achieve that under standard environments. And again, there are no standard environments, but when you're living in a jungle, when you're living in a desert or in a steppe, mm, when you're living in a city, just as one um, comparison, if you're living in an urban desert, you probably even need sunglasses to protect your eyes. If you are sitting in the forest, you don't. And if you are living in such an environment, in an urban desert, the tendency can be stated that it's increasingly the case that the illumination levels go up, 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 up. And the traffic light intensity goes up, then you have to increase the intensity of the front lights of your car. Then you have to increase the intensity of the dashboard instrumentation, and you have to increase the intensity of the street light, and so on. So this all conflicts with synchronizing with lunar rhythms, which could be presented by natural theater when you have visual access to the sky.
I mean, and that makes sense to me because wherever you are, even if you're perhaps living in a forest, at some stage, if someone's getting up in the night, they're going to have some access to lunar light that is influencing in whatever subtle way their I mean hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis to synchronize ovulatory and menstrual cycles. Um, and I believe there was a paper released at the beginning of the year in Science Advances, perhaps, essentially formalizing this idea of disruption of menstrual cycles secondary to artificial light at night, or essentially unyoking from natural rhythms. And but it seems to me, I don't you're the expert, but it seems to me that this is a less explored area of chronobiology than obviously than of circadian relationships and circadian biology.
Yeah, probably mainstream chronobiology is starting to discover the infradian and ultradian rhythmicities step by step. If you're in this field for longer times, then, for example, there is in my library I have a whole book which focuses on the biological effects of the moon lunar cycles
Wow.
on 250 pages or so, referencing all the data which existed until 1990. So it's chronobiology is not really an invention of our days, but it becomes more and more important, and even physicians understand better and better how important it is. And in the end, we will find chronobiological functions in each and every um, piece, part, and edge of our existence, because it is the most important fact that half of the day, one half of the 24 hours is dark and cold, and the other half is bright and hot. In extreme spoken in extremes. So this, if you want to live on this planet, you have, in the first go, you have to cope with this primordial condition. And so chronobiology is everything, and is embedded and can be found in every living creature and cell.
Mm. I think coral spawning was one of the key uh, functions that was regulated on a lunar rhythm that I was reading. Certain corals spawn on moons, on new moons. So yeah, I mean, absolutely fascinating, and the degree of conservation across species and orders of life, I think, is to me one of the most strong signals about why we should take this seriously as humans. I uh, I think I've asked you quite a few questions. Did you have any other topics that you wanted to discuss in this episode, or if not, we might have to speak again because yeah, it's been. I think we're recording now for quite a long time.
I think we have covered plenty of topics, and I don't necessarily have to talk about Jack Cruise's opinion that I'm going crazy with my research, with my product design, and so you sent me some link before, but I think everyone has his or her own right to have an opinion, and in this regard, I have mine, and others have theirs, and so I think we have covered a lot today, and hopefully it was somehow fruitful to follow my thoughts and pathways of thinking. And anyone who has access to both information channels can make his or her own decision if there is a truth at all, and if so, where the truth is located, in the middle or in the extremes.
I think there would be one more question for you, for the purists or the aficionados, the nerds. Can you elaborate on that incandescent setup that you deem to be gold standard? You mentioned a 12 volt DC supply and a um low voltage of. Can you
Yeah. Okay.
describe how one might set that up?
Um, so I would like to start with something important, and this is the electrical field topic. Each time you are operating with alternating current from the mains, you have electrical fields. And these electrical fields, they can reach values of 1,000 volts per meter, and even higher. Um, so an incandescent lamp operated on high voltage. I don't know, in your region, is it 230 volts or 120? 230 at 50,
240, yeah.
240, yeah, between 220 and 240 works out well, 50 hertz. So you have two lines in your socket, which is one is the neutral and one is the active, the phase and the neutral line. And then you have a third line, which is the earth link. And if you operate an incandescent lamp, you only operate it on the phase and the neutral, because there is only two contacts. You have the screw and you have the pin right in the middle, two contacts, which leads to the problem that if you if you just plug in the incandescent lamp and you don't even have to switch it on, it already produces up to 1,000 volts per meter, alternating information. You can make this audible. You will hear a loud buzz. It's not damped by a filament. So it's a harsh pulsation. And since our natural electrical environment is around about 100 to 150 volts per meter of static electricity, our cells can link to these levels. So the levels they exceed the natural static levels, and they are pulsed in the mains frequency, in double the mains frequency. So a standard incandescent lamp has, as any other lamp, which is connected via two poles, has an electrical field around it. And since there is no way to operate, or it's very impractical to operate an incandescent lamp, a high voltage incandescent lamp on DC, it's much easier to use an incandescent lamp which can be operated on DC. And for example, in cars, in recreational vehicles, and so you have this type of installation option. A car battery produces 12 volt, and you can use this as the energy storage and operate an incandescent lamp with 12 volts, and then you have zero alternating electrical field. You come down from 1000 to 0, and there is no information in terms of frequency occurring. When you are lazy and you don't want to use a battery, you can use a transformer. The transformer, like a charger, for example, for a smartphone, what number of connectors does your smartphone charger have?
Almost all of them just have two prongs. They don't have an earth ground.
So they produce exactly the same 1000 volts per meter, and once you have linked or hooked on your smartphone, it will also dissipate this. If you want to eliminate that, you have to connect the minus pole of the outlet of the transformer with the earth, with the ground. And this is the way to bring down the electrical field from 1000 to 0 as well. So it's almost as perfect as if you would use a battery. And this is also the condition how to operate the low voltage incandescent lamp, which is normally and ideally a halogen lamp, that you use a so-called PELV instead of a SELV, PELF versus self. It's a safety classification. And a PELF transformer has a connection between the primary ground earth link and the secondary minus pole on the outlet. And these transformers are ideal because they have no electrical field where you bring out the 12 volts and use them to operate a lamp, use them to operate your phone, whatever. The self, SELV, safety grade, is safer to the electrical engineer because there is no galvanic direct contact. So if your installation in the house would fail, and probably somewhere in the house the live wire would have contact with the ground, the self transformer would protect you from electrical hazard. But as long as the installation works well, the PELF would be the biologically ideal operation modality. And then if you have a transformer which is capable of varying the voltage number, so if you could vary from 6 to 12 volts, you would also have a perfect dimming option without any flicker. So this is the gold standard. No flicker, no electrical field, and flicker-free and temporal modulation-free dimming. Ideal for table desk lamps, which you bring closer to your head, for example. Ideal for nightstand lamps. In all other cases, it's best to keep 60 to 100 centimeters of distance in order to mitigate the electrical field stuff. But if there is a residual light modulation, there is no way to mitigate that, because the ripple, the 100 hertz ripple of an incandescent lamp, the thing is the high voltage lamp has to have a much higher resistance, electrical resistance. The filament acts as a resistor. And the higher the ohm value, the thinner the filament has to be. So the high voltage incandescent lamp has a thin filament compared to the low voltage filament. So the thermal capacity of a low voltage lamp is higher, with the result that when you measure the modulation depth, even if you are using the low voltage halogen lamp, 12 volt halogen lamp, if you are operating this on alternating current, you have between 3 and 5% of light modulation depth. In contrast to the 15 roundabout for the high voltage one, because the thermal capacity and so the buffer options or capacity is not as good. The thinner the filament, the higher the modulation, which is finally transmitted. And since it's a sine wave with no edges in the waveforms, it's difficult to detect, more difficult to detect than a nerve signal, which has a steep rise and then a slow or a mild decay. So again, it gets complicated when you step deeper into the rabbit hole. The waveform of the ripple, the waveform, the dirty electricity in the grid, and so on and so on. This can all be fully eliminated when you are working with direct current, and this is the most feasible environment if you are using 12 volt or 24 volt, but the common available halogen lamps are mostly 12 volts.
Okay, amazing. Thanks for that very detailed answer. I will definitely share with a friend, Tristan Scott, and who may or may not have come across as electrical engineer,
I know Tristan.
oh, fantastic. Yeah, he's
Daylight computing.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. Well, tremendous discussion, and maybe the final point that caps off the flicker whole topic is that sunlight has no flicker. So,
This is not true.
okay, take that back. Please correct me.
So I work with measuring modality which I call sonification, which is I make the temporal light modulation audible by using a photodiode and an amplifier and a speaker.
Wow.
And so I can listen to light sources, which is impressive because once you hear the flicker or the temporal light modulation, you are using a highly skilled harmonic analyzer. So if it's a comfortable hum, it's not so impressive onto your nervous system, but it's also not so easy to compensate. Because in order to compensate, you have to get a trigger where your compensation, your phase shifted compensation mechanism starts with. And this is difficult for sine waves. It's much easier for uh, mm, steeper rises and edgier waveforms. And so when you sonificate, when you listen to, for example, a bad light source, a bad LED, it's an awful sound. You don't want to tolerate this for longer than just for the testing. And
Mhm.
after a fraction of a second, you learned the lesson. This is bullshit. Mm, and if you listen to a candle, or if you listen to a non-flickering LED, or if you listen to sunlight, you hear a very, very subtle white noise containing all frequencies, but at a level which, yeah, even brings you into a trance-like state when you listen for longer to it. So the main thing is, as soon as you can detect a tone, a frequency, if a single frequency pops out of the white noise, of the subtle white noise, then the precondition for any interaction by resonance is fulfilled. And this is the reason why I wouldn't agree that sunlight is flicker free. Sunlight shows temporal modulation by the way it appears and disappears. Very, very, very low frequencies. Fire has light modulation because it flickers in a very soothing and comfortable way. But if there is some technical frequency popping out at rates where our nervous system is active, for example, our nervous system has to compensate this stimulus in order to protect itself uh, and the proper function. And this is an active process. And if there is no frequency, or if there are all frequencies, but at a level which is audibly nice and comfortable, then you don't have to worry. But still, there is something.
Amazing. Well, is that in any way a consumer accessible tool, or is this a highly specialized piece of uh,
It's a no, no, not rocket science. It's very simple, but I'm producing these light modulation testers for sonification since more than 20 years now. But the ones I offer, I have to build them from more or less from scratch. I had several attempts in the past. There was even a company 15 years ago. They built a consumer product which was capable of measuring what light modulation you have, the modulation depth, the frequency, the sonification. And it also was capable of detecting electrical fields which are transmitted by your body. So there was a finger contact. So you could hook on your body as an antenna for electrical activity. And this was, for example, ideal to demonstrate to kids that their body is an antenna, because linking your finger with the contact increased the noise. So I also used this sonification principle for electrical fields. And this was a combined device, but they stopped producing it because when kind of, it wasn't an online, but it was a remote reseller or retailer, and the lady who had to make the decision if they want to sell this device took the device home, and the next day she said, no, we can't sell this to our customers. I went home and every lamp did make noises, and I had noises throughout my living spaces. I cannot negatively uh, impact our customers because they also bought electrical appliances from us.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and in the meantime, I'm building the light modulation tester. It's a little box with a photovoltaic cell combined with an active speaker, and also combinable with a small oscilloscope. It's a device I sell in the sonification only version for around 150 euro, and the oscilloscope adds up to the whole package 250 or somewhat like that. But it's handmade piece by piece in small amounts, so I'm not able to provide this to the public in a normal way, because it's I haven't found a way yet to scale this up.
No, not without outsourcing it to the Orient.
They didn't understand yet what's important to make it really work. And then what I did is that I disseminated these devices to my technology partners. For example, the manufacturer of the heliolumen lamps, they have such a device, because before they send me a sample and I test it with my device and have to send it back, the sample of a lamp, because it still buzzes or produces noises, they test it on site. So it just optimizes the communication flow.
Mm.
And yeah.
What would some of these cheap photobiomodulation devices sound like then? Have you tested those? The ones that we were discussing earlier in the conversation. The like the
The
red light. Yeah.
photobiomodulation.
Yeah.
Aha. Yeah, it depends. It can happen. Everything can happen
Yeah, it makes sense.
depending on the. Normally, you would find a ripple in the 50 hertz, 100 hertz range, and then some transformers and the drivers add their operation frequencies as well. It depends, for example, also on for example, if you have a dimming option in the photobiomodulation device, it depends mm, on the technology for dimming, constant current or pulse width modulation. And if the pulse width modulation is the way to dim the light, then you would hear the base frequency of the pulse width modulation
Mm.
section of your driver.
Wow. Well, thanks for that overview. A very like technical insight into artificial light and measuring. But yeah, I would never contemplated that. But it's very interesting. I think we might round out our discussion, and we've covered a lot. Maybe in a future time we haven't talked about internally emitted light, and that's another whole discussion and topic that we very briefly touched on. But Yeah, thank you for your time. I really appreciated it. Dr. Wunsch, it was yeah, very, very interesting conversation. I think people will get a lot out of it. Um, and a lot of information that I hadn't heard before. So yeah, much appreciated.
Thank you. It was again a pleasure to raise and answer questions.